All right, let's get this started. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. This webinar is called The Finer Points of Weather in ForeFlight. This is a webinar we are doing with Jason Miller, one of our influencers, and it's part of the Pilot in Command with the Pros webinar series, which is a series that's sponsored both by AOPA and by Jeppesen, in addition to ForeFlight. So we're going to be doing these once a month over the next several months on various different scenario-based topics where some of our influencers like Jason Miller will join us to educate you all on how ForeFlight can help in some of these scenarios. So our presenters today are, like I said, Jason Miller. He is a close friend of ForeFlight who I think has been using it since it was first introduced on the iPhone in 2007. We go way back. And so he is a flight instructor, an ATP and CFII. His website is learnthefinerpoints.com, and he's the host of the Finer Points of Flying podcast and YouTube channel. So definitely go check him out if you're interested in hearing more of what he has to say about weather in ForeFlight and just flying with ForeFlight in general. And then on the ForeFlight side, we also have Chris Mauser. He's our customer success coordinator, has also been with the customer support team, and he's a CFII and MEI. So our agenda for today is going to start with Jason providing his principles for effective briefings. And just to kind of spoiler alert here, but the basic aspect of it is to standardize your approach. And so that's a really key point that he's going to spend some time talking about. And following up on those basic principles, we're going to go through three briefing scenarios using different flight plans to illustrate how the flight that you're planning is going to determine what kind of briefing you need to get. And so those briefings are going to start with a simple flight just around the airport, like doing touch and goes, then moving on to a longer moderate cross country, and finally to a multi-leg cross country where you're going to need to pull in more longer term weather than you would, for example, for the previous two. So just before we get started, a few starting points related to the GoToWebinar platform that we're using for this webinar. You can ask any questions you have via the GoToWebinar message panel, which you can expand by clicking that question button on the right. And you can just type in your questions at the bottom and hit send. And then our staff will be watching those questions come in and responding to them in real time as much as we can. So we'll be responding to those, like I said, and then at the very end, we will have some live Q&A where Jason and Chris will respond to some of the questions that have come in. Please try to submit your questions as soon as they pop into your head. Don't wait until you see Q&A pop up on the screen, because if you submit your question then, it probably is not going to be answered. So if you want to have your question answered, I highly recommend you submit it as soon as possible. If you have any audio problems, we do recommend joining from a computer, not a mobile device. We've just found that the GoToWebinar interface tends to be a little bit more effective when you're using it on a computer rather than an iPhone or iPad. So you're probably not hearing me speak if you have audio problems right now, but that's our suggestion. And finally, the webinar is being recorded, and you can access it in the next couple days at foreflight.com/PIC. So with that, I think we'll go ahead and jump into it, and I'll hand it over to Jason to kick us off.
All right, Sam, thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here today to get a chance to talk this through because, as you said, I've been using ForeFlight, I think pretty much since the beginning, since 2007, and it has just been incredible to watch the app grow. And there is an astonishing amount of information that pilots can get from ForeFlight today. So we aren't obviously going to be able to get into everything, but as Sam said, if you have specific questions, send them through. We'll try to get to those at the end. More than that, I wanted to try to help pilots create a framework through which they can process the information they're getting with confidence that they're not missing anything. And that, as ForeFlight becomes more and more powerful, and there are different areas of the app to look at the weather, there's different overlays you can lay down on top of it. It becomes a pretty complex system. And anytime a system is complex, it's going to benefit us as pilots to try to establish a standard approach. And this is not something that I'm making up. It's not something that we're making up. There's a proven precedent for this in aviation. And before we dive into our three scenarios that Sam laid out up front, the local flight, the moderate cross country, and the longer cross country, I just want to take a second to kind of highlight how standardization works. And I think AOPA is one of our co-sponsors here today, and the AOPA Air Safety Institute does some great research. And one of the things that they've reported is that over the last 30 years, airlines have been able to reduce their fatal accident rate by more than 80%, by 83%. And this is done in large part through standardizing pilot behavior. It's not that they're not flying complex machines, and it's not that they're not flying through tough weather challenges and all of that stuff. It's that as problems occur, they develop standard approaches to those problems to prevent the possibility of that problem from occurring again. And they do it with almost 100% success. It's pretty amazing. So, when we look at something like ForeFlight, where there are different ways to approach getting the weather and different areas of the app to get the weather, we're just going to borrow that idea and work to standardize our approach to it. And in that way, we're going to be sure that we don't miss anything, because as pilots in general aviation, we are at a significant disadvantage for two reasons. I mean, one is that we're in an unregulated environment, right? There's nobody looking over your shoulder saying, you missed that. You didn't check that thing on the weather, right? There's nobody doing that. So you're kind of your own chief pilot in that sense. But there's also no redundancy. So it's unregulated without redundancy. Even, if you think you have a standard approach, what tends to happen is you are sort of biased in one direction or the next. Now, like through standardization, I also want to provide a framework that allows pilots to behave in whatever way is natural for them, right? I don't want them lying to themselves. I don't want them lying to me. I want to try to figure out an approach to the app that caters to whatever your natural tendency is. And as I fly with pilots out there, I'm pretty sure I know what most folks are doing, and it's this thing that I call cherry picking. They're just kind of looking at the app, and I guess if we can look at my iPad, I can show you an example of what cherry picking sort of looks like. You're looking at the maps page. You might have a flight today, and so you kind of go here to the overlays and you start investigating the weather, and you're doing this based on what you think might be an issue. If you're like me and you have the Performance Plus, you might lay down the wind speeds, right? And you might look at that at different altitudes to try to get an idea of what the atmosphere is doing that day. Or you might be somebody that looks at airmets and sigmets. But even looking at this, right, if you forget to tap these little buttons right here, you may not be seeing the information that's available, right? So I didn't see the turbulence high there until I hit turbulence high. And what I want pilots to understand here is I am going to license you to do this cherry picking. I want you to feel confident in this and feel comfortable in this. Go through the app and look at the things that you think might be important. There's no radar returns here today in California, but if you're flying somewhere else, I can zoom out and show you. Maybe up there in the Pacific Northwest, radar might be on your mind. Maybe you're looking out the window and you see a thunderstorm approaching and you're thinking, how bad is that? Or is that approaching me? For me here in the Bay Area, I'll zoom back in, I'm often using the flight category. I just want to know, where's the fog, right? Is there fog along the coast? Ooh, Half Moon Bay is low IFR. So I'm often cherry picking myself, and I want pilots to feel free to do that. The thing is, if at any point in the cherry picking process you discover something, and it can all start with this, again, feel free to do it. Start by cherry picking. And if at any point you discover something in that process that would prevent you from flying, great, you cancel the flight, not a big deal. If you don't discover something in that cherry picking process, and I think we have a graphic that sort of illustrates this to you, but we can show you that in a second here. If you discover something, if you don't discover anything, there it is. If you don't discover anything in that process, at the end of it, you are going to have to do some structured briefing, and that's going to depend on whether or not you are staying local to the airport, or whether you are flying a moderate cross country, or whether you're flying a long cross country. And we can get to that stuff in a moment. I can tell you as an example of if what it looks like if you don't do that. And this is a story that's like real from my flying life. Not something I'm super proud of, but I'm going to be honest with you guys so that we can all learn together. I'm a CFII and I'm working with a student, and both of us are kind of getting the weather by cherry picking. This is a few years back. And we met early in the morning at San Carlos. It's like 6 in the morning, and we get out there to the end of the runway, and we thought we knew what we were doing. We had briefed our flight. We had sitting there in the run-up area, and the airport operations vehicle, which was driving around the airport, this is before the tower was open, gets on the frequency and says, "Hey, you guys know that the runway is closed today, right?" And it's like, I'm just looking at my student who's, an attorney and a really bright guy, and me, myself, an experienced double I who flies there every day. And somehow both of us missed the NOTAM that said the runway was closed that day. So, we kind of, oh yeah, we knew that. We're just doing a maintenance run up. We got back to the flying club. But that's kind of around the time I realized, okay, look, the cherry picking leaves so many holes. It leaves so many opportunities to be biased in certain directions, to miss some little bit of information, some little button tap that I forgot to do, that at the end of that, even if I didn't find anything, at the end of that, there must be some structured briefing. And that's the basic idea behind what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to sort of do it through those 3 scenarios we just mentioned, and we can look a little bit more specifically at what those structured briefings are. But just know it all sort of starts with a license to do that cherry picking. Feel free, feel good about it. As long as you do this structured thing at the end, you can walk away from the information with confidence. So, all right. Should we look at a local
Jay,
flight?
this is Chris here.
Hey, Chris.
This is Chris, and I just wanted to first of all say hi and thanks for doing this, and thanks for having me on the show here. And thank you for that story. That story is actually really, really good and true. And I have similar stories, and so I also wanted to kind of share that this topic, this whole concept really speaks to me as a seasoned flight instructor as well, because it addresses several items here. One is some human factors, right? When you're a new pilot, you kind of just don't know what you don't know, right? So when you get into you're going to the airport, or you're getting prepared for a flight, there's that level of unsureness, that confidence. You don't have those hours behind you to really be confident and knowledgeable what you're doing. You're also looking for your instructor to guide you, and so this allows kind of a way for you to kind of just address and approach your briefings and the way you get knowledge before you go flying. But it also addresses on the other end of the spectrum, right? Your seasoned pilot, the pilot that might quote know everything, which no one ever does, right? But maybe that pilot is in that zone of complacency where, oh, well, I looked at the weather yesterday, it looked good, I'm just gonna go and we'll figure it out kind of thing. This allows some structure. I love the cherry picking concept because it's the truth, right? We just kind of naturally gravitate towards things. Things catch our eye. We see that radar on the screen, like, oh, let's look at that. And you might get really involved in that, and using ForeFlight to do the playback scenario or zooming in and zooming out. But then you kind of maybe forget that there's other things out there. All right, so it allows that seasoned pilot, that new pilot, to have a structure, but it also allows you to have some freedom. And then ultimately, before you go to that airplane, your gut is starting to tell you, wait, you might have missed some things. So having that structure allows your gut and your brain to tell you you might be missing things, and that standardization will help you reach that confidence that you've covered all the bases. So I really like this concept, and thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, man, 100%. In fact, I'm really glad you brought up experienced pilots, because I end up talking about standardization a lot. It's like an entire chapter in the ground school app that we just put out, and I wrote a book on it, and I really, really believe in it. It's become like a thesis of my teaching. But I always tell pilots that it's not hard to do this the first time or the second time or the third time. The real challenge in an unregulated the environment that's not redundant is forcing yourself to do it the 10,000th time with the same diligence you did the first time, even if you think you know what you're doing. That's, complacency doesn't quite cover it, because I feel like we all fall victim to that. And it is a very, very difficult task to bring yourself fully to bear on. So thanks for mentioning that.
Absolutely.
It's really true. All right, cool. Should we move on to our first type of scenario here, the sort of local flying? This is one where I think, back to the idea that I don't want pilots lying to me any more than I want them lying to themselves. I think it's unfair to ask a pilot at the end of all that cherry picking to go through the same length weather briefing they're going to do for a flight from, Denver to Los Angeles, for example, as they are when they go out and do touch and goes. It just doesn't, those aren't the same thing. And I feel like if I ask, as an instructor, I feel like if I ask pilots to do that over time, that challenge that we just mentioned, bringing themselves to fully bear on the task at hand, that is looking at the briefing in detail, if I ask them to do that for every single flight, including the ones where they're just running pattern work on a beautiful Saturday afternoon, ultimately they're going to be lying to themselves and then lying to me. So after really thinking about it, it's my belief, and I hope, Chris, that you feel the same way, but for a flight that's not leaving an airport, and I think our regulation 91-103, which describes pilot pre-flight action, after it says you have to know everything, it divides flights into those that are in the vicinity of an airport and those that are not in the vicinity of an airport, assuming VFR. And for the ones that are in the vicinity of the airport, I feel like if you look at the current conditions, the forecast conditions, the Notams, and the TFRs, that can be your formal briefing process at the end of cherry picking.
Oh, absolutely. Just so I really like this too, because it's really simple. What you're doing is staying in the pattern, which, you're staying in your local environment. I'm sure if you're in flight training, or that's your home airport, you're very intimate with that airport. The terrain, the runways, even maybe the guys in the tower if it's towered. So you don't have to go into this big long hour briefing, and really overdo it, because by then you won't even get to go fly.
Right.
This just allows you it's common sense. This is what I like about this. Flying doesn't have enough common sense. We kind of get so wrapped up in some of these technicalities that we just don't check our common sense. So keep going. Thank you.
Yeah, 100%. And I feel like if you fall into that place where you end up lying to yourself, or do like that kind of ostrich approach where it's like, well, or flipping through the briefing at 100 miles an hour because it's just this rote thing you're doing, the standardization has failed, right? Like the effect of what we're really going for has failed. And at the end of the day, you don't want that. You want that feeling that you were describing of being confident and knowing that you can move on like fully. So one thing, again, we're not going to go too far into specifics, but if I could just go back to my iPad for a second here, I'm going to just point out the MOS forecast. So we talked about the current conditions at the airport, right? Of course, we have the METAR, and I'm looking at San Carlos here. This is my local area. We can see the local hourly weather report. Many folks are familiar with the TAF forecast, and I just wanted to point out this MOS forecast, which is really makes forecasts available for so many airports that maybe in the past didn't have them. And it's my understanding of the MOS that it is the computer generated model. In fact, I remember at an air show in Seattle once, somebody from, I think it was the National Weather Service or one of those agencies, told me that the main difference between the TAF and the MOS is a human being. That with a TAF, you've got a human being that looks at the MOS data and brings other local knowledge to bear and creates a TAF, whereas the MOS is the computer model. Not always 100% accurate, but certainly a lot of the time, barring any little microclimates like we get in the Bay Area or whatever, but most of them are accurate, and it provides some forecast for folks that might not have a TAF close by. Also, we're going to talk more about Notams in the when we get to the moderate cross country and the longer one, but don't miss the fact that you have a Notam tab here as well, sort of divided up into different things that might apply to this airport or the operations or procedures at this airport. So
yeah, and Jason, if I can share my screen for just a second, I will also add to your kind of local flavor here. You'll notice that I'm also on the same airport, San Carlos, but if you go one step further, you can go to the daily. And if I tap on daily, now I can actually get kind of more of a, it's not as technical as a METAR or a TAF, but I really like this because, maybe a few days before I'm ready to go do some touch and goes at San Carlos, or I'm getting ready for, one of my first lessons, landing lessons with my instructor, I can just look at this and just get a real generic flavor for what is going to happen that day. Maybe I'm going out tomorrow and I can just take a look at that, tap on that Thursday there, and you'll see it come up on my screen. Now I'm just getting, stuff I can just read and soak in and get a really good picture, all without having to read a bunch of, jargon or aviation jargon. So I really do appreciate and really like our forecast feature that we put in ForeFlight.
Yeah, that's awesome. We can come back to that too, but that's like when we get to the longer cross countries, that's such a great way to outlook something that's in the future also,
Absolutely.
Yeah. But that's really it. So just to kind of summarize the airport environment after the cherry picking process is over, assuming you haven't found anything during that process that would prevent you from flying, check those 4 things, Notams, TFRs, and yeah, I mean, and the TFR one, like definitely, if we can go back to my iPad just for a second, I will show you exactly why that's on there. If you did take like even a flight locally, let's say you're up in Lake Tahoe and you're going to go fly around today and you don't check the TFRs, it's very easy for you to go ahead and miss something like, where's my TFR layer? There it is. Something like that, right? So you might think, oh, I'm just going to depart Tahoe and just be out there flying patterns south of the airport, but you completely missed that there's this huge TFR right there. So that stuff's so easily missed in the cherry picking process that it's important to make sure that that is part of the 4 things you check as a standard procedure when you're flying in the local airport environment.
Oh yeah, I mean, so think about it, right? You're staying at a local airport. Like I said, you're probably familiar with it. What are the kind of the 2 basic things that might get you in trouble with, winds or some kind of weather that's out of your skill set, maybe a crosswind or legalities, right? Some kind of NOTAM, some kind of TFR that you didn't account for. So, even though it's your home airport, yeah, you want to cover those basic things that could get you in trouble.
Yeah, 100%.
Also, one more note, if you don't mind, is that also if you are just briefing for a flight at your home airport, it is also a little tempting to maybe depart the pattern and just maybe go somewhere else. Maybe your pattern's getting a little busy. I know it where I was instructing, it would get 5, 6 aircraft in the pattern, and that's great and all, but you've kind of maybe circumvented the intent here, which is to just stay at your local airport. If you're going to leave, you maybe haven't briefed yourself completely. So, consider that when you're out in the pattern.
Yeah, that's a really good point. This is obviously meant to empower people and not limit them, right? So like you'd have to be really cautious and use your judgment there. If you are going to another airport, you have not looked at the current conditions, forecast conditions, NOTAMs, TFRs, all that stuff, you can get in some pretty bad trouble. So I guess you'd have to be fully committed to, I'm just flying patterns at my airport today. Otherwise, you would do the next thing. That's a fairly reasonable segue, right? Where we're going to go into this sort of moderate cross country and look at like, in my neighborhood, it'd say like a flight from San Carlos out to Modesto or something like that. And we can take a look at an actual weather briefing. So, let's go back to my iPad real quick and I'll just show folks how you would retrieve one of these. And then Chris, maybe you can help us figure out those different types right there. But there's the flight, like it's just San Carlos to Modesto. It's not too far. It's, 70 miles, 60 miles, something like that. And it's a pretty common training cross-country route. So for a flight like that, we'll call it a moderate cross-country. Of course, we're talking weather today, so there's a whole bunch of other flight planning stuff you might want to do, including research the route, look over the airspace, all that sort of stuff. But let's assume that's done. And you send this over to the flights tab. That's where you're going to get your weather briefing. I didn't really look at the altitude details there. I probably should have, but we're gonna go ahead and retrieve that briefing. We'll bring that down. And the nice thing about this briefing, maybe even before I go into that, Chris, can you tell me of those different types here, which one am I looking at?
Absolutely. This is our HTML briefing. So the way I kind of explain this briefing is, remember back in the day, you could call a briefer, or you could even go into a flight service station and sit down with a briefer. This is exactly what you would get. You would get it step by step, line by line. You know, you would get textual, you would get graphics, you would get a really good explanation. And when you left or you hung up with that briefer, it was crystal clear. There wasn't any ambiguity about what you were doing. This HTML briefing literally walks you step by step by step. And if you are unsure, you can go back. You can read it at your pace. I'm a visual learner, so I love to click on the maps and zoom in and kind of take inventory, visually. So we also offer a couple of different briefings. You might see our PDF and just our straight text. So maybe some of our non-US subscribers, you might be looking for this in your settings. If you went to more settings, you could actually scroll down and choose the briefing you want, and you can go ahead and do that. So more settings, and you have to scroll down a few inches there, and you'll come to the a little bit more, and right there under flights briefing format, graphical HTML is the one that Jason's looking at. If you want to click on that, you'll see the other two. The graphical PDF would be maybe for some of our business customers. We won't go into that too much, but then some of our non-US customers will also be able to get the graphical PDF. And then the classic text is kind of really old school, not a lot of flash to it, but some of our maybe more seasoned pilots don't want all the flash, they just want the data so they can go through it quickly and move on.
Got it. Yeah, that's cool. I honestly didn't know that was there. You told me that, so it's cool that I'm on the one I like, I guess. All right, so here we are looking at, like Chris said, we're looking at a standard briefing. This is in the same format you would get if you were to call a weather briefer, or if in today's world you could even find a weather service station that will let you in. But this is a standard format, and one thing that's going to be helpful, I think, to sort of keep your eye on the big picture here is to take this little hamburger menu and pop it out so that you can see. There it goes. So you can see like what the actual overview is. Like the first thing that they're going to show you, adverse conditions, then give you a synopsis of the general weather system, and then go through current weather forecasts, and ultimately end up in Notams. So again, we're not going to go through this in every little aspect of this, but we'll try to keep this pretty high level. Otherwise, this webinar is going to go on for a long time. But here, that you get not just the text of things, but you also get the graphic picture, which is helpful. You also get the text, and you move through those warnings to see if any of those apply to you. And just like you were with the cherry picking, you're looking for things that would cause you to not fly, that would be unsafe. This is one of my favorites. I like to kind of take a good look at the surface analysis and just make sure I understand what the atmosphere is doing. That here we have low pressure over California. We've got a cold front coming out of the Pacific Northwest. We saw that manifest in some rain earlier up in the Pacific Northwest, but so far so good here. Just to keep my eye on the general big weather picture. And then we get into the actual current conditions along the route of flight. One finer point here I want to make sure that people don't miss is this plain text thing. I always have to turn that on. Chris, is there a way to default that on, do you know, or
no, sir? You're just gonna have to click it on, and it's actually kind of fun to toggle it off and on to see the difference. Again, from a student pilot perspective, the plain text helps you understand the data, but it also, by switching it back and forth, you can learn some of the the text that the FAA publishes as far as how METARs are spelled in the kind of the old English, if you will, the old aviation language.
Yeah, yeah, and I kind of, being old school myself, tend to see it easier, honestly, in code. I'm just so used to looking at it that way. But at least folks know they have the option, like whatever's more intuitive to them, they can just change it so they're actually getting the data. Um, there was something that you wanted that I thought was really important that you wanted to say about passing times. Don't let me go over
No,
that. Did I do
you
that?
nailed it. Yeah, go back. I was gonna say, no, talking about the finer points. Go back one click there,
Okay.
and you'll notice it's real subtle. And I can actually show you on my. Let's see. Let's go back out of the surface analysis. Back. Notice where it says active during passing time. All right.
Yeah.
Again, kind of back to that personalized briefing. Almost like talking with a briefer. You know, when you were actually getting a phone call from a briefer back in the day, you weren't able to really pinpoint where you were going to be in space and time as it relates to your briefing, right? So ForeFlight's actually going to be able to pinpoint where you're going to be at a specific time relative to the active and valid times of, in this case, an air met. And I just think that is so cool that I'm able to actually correlate a time of flight in flight with an active time, and just the power and the situational awareness, because that's what it's all about, right? More knowledge means better situational awareness, and better situation awareness means better decisions. And this is such a great decision making tool. So thank you for
Yeah, that's
showing that.
great. Yeah, no worries. So passing time, just to say it again, is the time that you're passing that area. That's what that refers
Absolutely.
to.
And if
Okay.
you don't mind, real quick, just go to the TAFs and you'll see it. We've actually color coded it as far as passing time and what kind of weather you might experience. So go to the hamburger menu and TAFs.
There we go. Sorry, I got
And
there.
yep, and then we'll hit the X on that. There you go, and you'll see it's green along your passing times. But if there was some kind of marginal or IFR weather, it would actually follow the magenta or red if,
Hmm.
as your so again, super powerful. I'm a visual learner. Lots of pilots are. This really correlates with just a lot of three-dimensional things going on here, and so much more information is able to be understood before I even get in the airplane and go fly. And also, one more point is when you get these briefings, they go with you. They're in your iPad. So if you're along the flight and you recall during your briefing something that you wanted to maybe learn more about in flight, pull up that briefing and go ahead and cycle through, and you can find everything that you want all right there stored in the memory.
Yeah, that's great. So folks saw me at the beginning request the briefing, and then the iPad showed retrieving the briefing. And Chris, you just made a great point. So making sure everybody knows that's retrieved onto your iPad locally. Even if you're not connected to the internet later, you can be in the airplane and look back at all of this data. So. All right, great. I also wanted to just point out that I turned on plain text here again for TAFs for anybody that, that code becomes a little bit more cumbersome. So for anybody that would prefer to read the forecast here like that, that's available as well. All right, and then we go through the winds. I didn't actually pre-select my altitude, but this is cool the way ForeFlight knows what altitude we're flying at and shows the winds aloft as it relates to our altitude, both during climb and descent, which is cool. And then again, I had some IFR altitude in there, but if it was interpolated between some VFR altitude, ForeFlight would show us which winds apply very graphically, as you said. Then we get into my favorite section, the Notams. Is there anything you wanted to say, Chris, before we dive into Notams?
Yeah, Notams is a big animal, right? And just looking at the FAA and how they handle Notams, it's really just a data dump, right? They have thousands of Notams, and obviously the longer the flight, the more and more Notams that you're going to have to come across. So on that front, as an instructor, teaching this stuff to my students, I always tell them, a couple of things. One, you have to be patient because there's a lot of Notams, and if you're maybe in a hurry to get somewhere, you're most likely going to skip the Notams part, right? That's kind of like the path of least resistance is to skip those, but those will get you in some big trouble, as you told us your story a little bit earlier. Another thing is you just got to practice reading them. ForeFlight does a really good job of, the plain text. I will say that. But again, there's so many of them. The better you are at reading them, it's like a bit of a foreign language. So you have to practice. You have to stay versed in it, and just like I said, be patient. And then another thing is that ForeFlight will give you your Notams in a briefing, but we also have done some really cool things with Notams as far as where you're able to find them in the app itself. So we've taken all these really, grand, multiple Notams, and we've actually been able to kind of carve out the ones that apply to certain areas of flying. For example, if it's a runway Notam or whatnot, you can actually go into the airport's tab, and you can actually read Notams about the airport itself. Okay. If you're an IFR pilot and you're concerned about maybe some of the FDC Notams that are applicable to approach plates, you can actually go into an approach plate and notice that there's a little red banner at the top that says Notams. And so you can actually read Notams about that approach. So ForeFlight has really taken a large, cumbersome, and really complex subject, and we've done our best, and we've done a really good job, I think, of breaking it down, making it more manageable. And we are working on Notams as we speak to make it even better. And I've heard that even the FAA has acknowledged and is going to do something to make the Notam system a little less painful.
Yeah, and that's really important because it is huge. And I'm actually at a place in my flying now where I'm using ForeFlight exclusively for weather briefings. But as over the last like 10 years or whatever, as this was all transitioning, I used to play a game with my students where I'm driving down from San Francisco to the airport. I would call flight service and get myself a briefing. And I would tell them they can brief however they want, which was normally through ForeFlight, which we're using. And the game was, as long as I don't know more than you do about the weather, we're good, right? And always they knew what I knew on every aspect of the weather, the METARs, the TAFs, the airmets, all of that sort of stuff. But when it came to Notams, sometimes I would find my students didn't catch the little ones, like the VASI lights are out at the destination airport we're going to for some given runway. And it is hard. So this is where, when you bring your full attention to bear on this, do not give short shrift to this Notam section. This is going to take a bit of time, but you can see there's a lot of Notams here. So what you have to do, and as Chris mentioned, ForeFlight does an excellent job of sort of parsing these out, not just in different locations in the app, but as different heading titles here. Like we're looking at these departure Notams, then we can click over to destination Notams, then en route navigation Notams and that sort of thing, and en route service Notams. And what you really want to avoid as you're working to polish your own standard procedure here is going through this so rapidly that you're not getting the data. What you want to try to do is stack the deck in your favor. You have to know this information. That is non-negotiable. So turn on the plain text so that you can read the information clearly and read it all, and then do what Chris mentioned, give yourself some redundancy. At the end of that, go back to those other locations and say, did I miss anything? And ForeFlight has been good about putting these Notams sort of back in front of you where you're going to need them, where it applies, whether it's here at the airport page or whether it's over here on the approach plates. But just double check yourself to give yourself some redundancy to say, okay, I'm highly confident now that I did not miss any Notams. And I think that's the best you can do, and that will be effective for you to walk away from this briefing feeling confident, not just about the weather and the TFRs, but also that you didn't miss the Notams that the runway is closed or whatever.
Oh yeah, I have a brief story about Notams. It really just helps drive home, like you said, even those kind of really smaller Notams that teaching night flying, going on night cross countries, done this flight dozens of times, no brainer, almost in that complacency, like this will be easy. Sure enough, we get to the airport, go to click the pilot control lighting, and it's not coming on. Ended up coming back, looking at the Notams, and sure enough, they had put the pilot control lighting on a different frequency, and it was issued via Notam. So learn that lesson the hard way.
Yeah, that's the way we learn them all. That's why we're here telling you guys these stories, so you don't have to learn these hard lessons on your own.
The finer points, yes, sir.
Yeah, right. All right, now I want to make sure we save enough time for questions, and we still want to get through some of the finer points on briefing a longer flight. So, even pretty early on in training, I find myself telling folks that long cross countries, like a flight from California to Florida, is just a series of short cross countries. Like, you know, a cross country is a cross country. So when you're flying long distances, for most of us, unless you're flying a jet or something like that, but for most of us, it's a series of shorter legs. But there are some aspects to briefing that I would pay a little bit more attention to if I knew that my ultimate destination was in a different time zone, or maybe at the end of a long day or something like that. And this slide lays it out perfectly. We can look at them in a second, but I do a little bit more work on the imagery tab with the prognostic charts. You know, for a flight from San Carlos to Modesto, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be gone for 2 days. But if I'm flying from San Carlos to Oshkosh, it's a whole different deal. I might be, and I might have to divert, and I might end up in a hotel for a night, and I might need a larger view of the weather, and also the significant weather outlook. Those are you know, two really important things to me anyway. And we could just take a quick look on my iPad on where you find this stuff. It's this imagery tab here along the bottom, just making sure you don't miss that you go in there, and this will have this, like, it's all listed under prog charts here on the left. It will have the latest surface analysis, which we saw a beautiful color version of at the beginning of our ForeFlight briefing. But you can also sort of now swipe forward in time and say, what is that expected to do 6 hours from now? What is that expected to do 12 hours from now, and so on, and just move forward in time that way. If you swipe fast enough, you can almost get it to animate. And then also the outlook, significant weather here is something that you can look at just to make sure that you have a good feel for what these traditional forecast products, these traditional graphic forecast products are showing you about the weather over a period of days. Chris, I should throw it over to you too, because this is a great place to talk about, I think, that 7-day outlook thing that you were showing us before.
Yeah, very cool. So go ahead and you know, let's say you're going from your home airport to that longer flight, right? And
I'm going somewhere out here, Tonopah.
sure. I mean, think about it. We've all been there. Maybe if you're a certificated pilot and you're flying friends or family, or you have a mission that takes you far away from your home airport, when you land and you're there for a few days, are you not on your phone looking at the weather all the time, right? You're always right.
Right.
You know, that local flight, it's a no-brainer. You know, it's going to be this or that for the TFR. But now, you know, you're going to be there 2, 3, 4 days, and people are relying on you, or you need to get back to your family or to work, what have you. So you're really keeping an eye on the weather. Just simply tap anywhere you want on the map, and go ahead and tap, and then hit that WX button. And now you can get that 10-day forecast I mentioned earlier. But now it's not specific to an airport; it's specific to a region, right? Just again, every time I go somewhere, I'm always like that little voice in my head is, you got to keep an eye on the weather. What's it going to be like in 3 days from now? And it's great to look through all these, you know, aviation weather forecasts and whatnot, but just looking at a basic forecast, of seeing something like this where it says VFR, no ceiling, kind of puts me at ease and lets me enjoy my vacation or wherever I'm at, not constantly have my head buried in my phone instead of enjoying what I'm doing.
Yeah. And then anyone who missed that, that's the little WX here at the top, just to the right of add to route. You can see that WX there. Yeah, and looking over this too, I also wanted to make sure we didn't leave out, because I think it's so amazing, is this forecast discussion that you can read here in the TAF. So like here I'm looking at San Carlos, just right on the TAF column, you can see the white forecast discussion that is tappable. You can click that and you can see what the forecasters are saying in sort of a conversational tone about the weather that's moving through the area.
Awesome. Yeah, again, back to that common sense, right? It doesn't have to be all hieroglyphics and code. You can just simply just have knowledge and soak in that knowledge and just have a really good understanding without having to get lost in the minutia. So I really like this you know, the 10-day, the forecast discussion, all those things really speak to me. Even as a seasoned pilot, I really just like to know what I'm getting into. And then as things progress, yeah, I can start getting into you know, the more finite things, right? Getting into the TAFs and the TAF coding and the METARs, and those kind of things. So just information is what it's all about, you know?
Yeah, 100%. And this comes in handy, and the Bay Area is so wild because it's like just these little microclimates. Like the weather at San Francisco Airport can be dramatically different than the weather at Palo Alto, right? Like some days the winds at Palo Alto are 8 knots, San Francisco is gusting 35, right? Because it's like in this little chute. And so these types of discussions straight from a forecaster's mouth, so to speak, but like written out as though they're speaking to you, can provide a lot of insight into local climates that can't really be understood via something like a MOS.
Oh yeah, well I'm in Texas, and they say if you don't like the weather in Texas, just wait 10 minutes, and that is very true.
They used to say that in Chicago too. They don't say that so much in the Bay Area. That really, I want to make sure we leave time for folks that have questions. But that kind of gets me through, the finer points of what I wanted to talk about. I think that just in sort of wrapping up standardization, I want people to appreciate that it's standardization that allows you the freedom to improvise, right? So for people who think, well, I could never like constrain myself in that way, I always use like the example of like blues music or something, right? Like it all sounds the same, specifically so the soloists can improvise around it, right? You have to know where the train is going if you're going to jump off the train for a minute and go run out into the field and come back. So by standardizing your flying and giving yourself a framework through which to process the weather, it will allow you to be a creative pilot with confidence. It'll allow you to be confident about the information you have and allow you to improvise where and when it's appropriate. So
absolutely, through this process, you'll know, right? When you go flying, and maybe the first piece of challenging flying, whether it be weather or airspace or whatnot, you'll know, your gut will tell you, yeah, I'm briefed, I'm confident. Otherwise the opposite is true, right? You don't get in, you don't do the finer points, you don't do the funnel effect, you don't give yourself the freedom. You just kind of, don't really do much of anything standard at all. Next thing you know, man, I really wish I had that information. And now a lot of times once you're airborne, you're offline, you don't have that data available to you. So really good. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, it's really true. And I think that, what you said about about knowing when you feel confident, the sad part is I think so many pilots are used to operating in a space where they're just not confident. And I think as you add this type of approach to gathering your weather and you stick to it and you force yourself to stick to it and you're diligent about that, you will start to learn what that feeling of confidence is. And then you will feel the way Chris just mentioned. You'll sort of feel naked if you haven't done it, right? You'll feel like something's wrong. And that's always a good skeptical mindset.
Yeah, cool.
So I think Sam's going to tell us if we have questions. Maybe we answered every person's question in the course of that webinar.
Yeah, I wish. But yeah, thank you so much, Jason and Chris, for an amazing presentation. And thank you so much to all of the viewers for all of the really great questions. If you haven't gotten your question answered, there is a very good chance that that's not going to happen now, because we have a ton of questions here. But before we jump into the live Q&A here, I do want to stress that if you have a question that does not get answered, we don't want to leave you hanging there. So please just email team@foreflight.com with that question. And it's a virtual certainty that they've received that question 1,000 other times, and they'll be able to get back to you, within 5 or 10 minutes with a response. So, don't let your question just not get answered, because we can absolutely do that. So moving on to some of these questions that came in, a lot of really interesting ones, some pretty tough questions as well. Jason, there was one question about whether you can suggest an approach to using ForeFlight for in-flight weather. And so without, we could have an entire webinar just on that question, but do you think that there's a short executive summary you could provide of that?
Well, I can tell you two things for certain. Make sure that you have a Sentry or some other, ADS-B receiver, right? So anybody that's planning on using ForeFlight in an effective way in flight is going to have to make sure that they're getting all the information they can get. And the second one thing that popped into my head, which is kind of not related to the weather specifically, is don't get lost in it. So I don't know what you're using in ForeFlight to fly, like what kind of mount you have, or I fly with an iPad mini, but there's so much in there in real time. Just make sure you're not heads down in the cockpit going too deep into that iPad. It makes a huge difference to pick it up so that your head is not down and hold it up next to the flight instruments, or mount it in that way so that you can divide your attention between flying the airplane, looking out the window, and feeling free to go through and do that sort of in-flight cherry picking. And it's a real thing. There is more, like, we're at a place where on some flights, I want to be careful when I say this to you, but on some flights, you're better off staying in the airplane, moving along at real time while you figure out these weather decisions. Whereas back in the day, you'd want to land and use one of those pilot brief systems or whatever. Often now with the kind of information we're getting in the cockpit through ForeFlight, there's a lot to be learned. So as I'm talking here, another thing too is use a lot of caution when you're, don't use ForeFlight to circumvent radar returns as though you've got onboard weather radar. So understand that there is a delay, and the delay is probably twice as long as you think it is, because it takes time to compile those signals and send them up through the ADS-B system. So use extra caution in that regard. But other than that, like, I think in-flight cherry picking, as long as you don't get lost in it, heads down in the cockpit, is something that can be really valuable. And I guess I don't know how to get more specific on it than that, but there are a few thoughts anyway.
Awesome. Yeah. And Chris, is there anything you want to quickly add onto that answer?
Well, I brought it up earlier that, when you get ready for a flight, you actually do the flight, whether you file or not. You can generate that briefing, and that can go with you, but you also are going to want to pack, right? So ForeFlight offers a pack function at the it's on the Maps tab or it's on the Flights tab, and that's going to give you the most up-to-date Notams, weather, TFRs, anything relative to your route. That's basically on a 25 nautical mile corridor for an entire route. So really huge to pack. Don't forget that. And then, maybe a lesser known or remembered thing is, don't be afraid to call flight service on the frequency. I'm a huge fan of Sentry. Don't get me wrong. You're getting an amazing amount of information and technology for pennies, and definitely don't fly without it. But, when all fails, you can call flight service and get some updated information that way.
Yeah, and actually, if I can even piggyback on that, Chris, too, I think it's so powerful to have the information in front of you and to have sort of made some estimates yourself, but then also talk to flight service so that the things that they're saying are no mystery to you. It's like you were just looking at that picture, and if, like in the example of radar returns, you're kind of looking at it, they'll mention it too, and you can kind of cross-check some of the stuff you've seen. So it really just adds to the safety there.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. And Jason, since you mentioned onboard radar, I'm going to go ahead and answer this other question that came up, specifically, what is four-color radar and how do you check to see if it's on or off? So I'll just address that. Four-color radar is a setting you can find in the map settings menu, which is that gear button next to the FPL button. When you have the radar layer enabled, there's this four-color radar setting, and essentially when you turn that on, it just reduces all of the radar colors down to just 4. Yeah, so perfect. If we go down, and there it is, 4 colors. So you have it turned on right now. And the reason we introduced that was essentially to allow you to make the radar in ForeFlight look more like onboard radar, which is generally shown using only 4 colors. So unless you're flying with onboard radar and you want to make sure that those always kind of look similar, there's not really a reason to use that, because you're just reducing the the amount of different levels of reflectivity that could be shown at one time. One other thing, actually, while we're looking at that, the internet radar coverage that was shown directly below that will now, Jason, if you just zoom way out, so we're looking at the whole U.S., that adds some hatch marks in the places where we do not have radar shown. So there you go. You can see it says radar not available.
Sorry, let me get you back there. I wanted to turn off all that other noise.
Oh yeah. Yeah, so that's a good way just to see where radar is actually not available versus where, there just isn't anything to pick up.
I see. Yeah, there it is.
So moving on here, what does MOS stand for? MOS, it stands for Model Output Statistics. And another common question I saw on this was, why can the TAF and MOS and daily forecasts all be so different from each other? Jason or Chris, do one of you want to start addressing that?
Well, I mean, where the MOS and the TAF are concerned, I mean, I had that very same question for the Weather Service folks that I talked to, but it's really the human intervention, as far as I can understand it, where you just have years and years of experience looking at the weather, looking at the computer model, and knowing that even though the computer is saying San Francisco, which might just be 15 miles north of San Carlos, is going to experience the same weather, I've been watching this weather for 25 years, and I'm telling you that ain't going to happen. What's going to happen is the fog's going to bunch up here. This is going to come through this channel. And so sometimes in my local area, the TAF and the MOS diverge due to that human intervention where the computer model fails. Now, granted, this is an area where there are, like I said, pretty intense little microclimates, so maybe that effect is exaggerated. And I just want to say in most places, they match pretty well, but at least in my area, that's the reason sometimes.
Yeah, and regarding the difference between MOS and the daily forecasts, I think it just comes down to the fact that they are different weather models, and so they will produce different results at different times. Sometimes one is more accurate than the other, but that's why it's nice having both, because it's just two different sources you can consult with, and when they agree, then it's probably a good indication that that they're right.
Yeah.
Moving on here. When you're talking about cherry picking, are you referring to all the sections, all of the map layers like radar, lowest tilt, enhanced satellite on the maps page? So Jason, could you maybe clarify what resources you're talking about when you're discussing cherry picking?
Yeah, it can really be anything. So yes, to your question, any of those layers on the maps page, even going over to the airport tab and looking at the METAR, or reading the forecast discussion, or just feel free to hunt for anything you want that would cause you to not fly. And that's sort of the game you're playing if you're approaching the flight on all levels from a skeptical mindset, even through the pre-flight. Like when you pre-flight the plane, you're looking for the reason you shouldn't fly it that day. And if you can't find it, great, you go flying. And same with the weather. Like there's what am I missing here? Like what's the thing? And I think people should feel free to sit on their living room sofa, pull out ForeFlight, and just hunt and do whatever comes naturally. My point is that you can't end there. And that was my runway closed story. Or what tends to happen to people is they have some sort of confirmation bias. Like I said, if they look out the window and it's cloudy, I'm sure they're going to check the radar. If the wind is blowing, they'll probably lay down the wind overlay. Or if they know the president is in town, they're going to lay down TFRs. But what tends to happen is you sort of self guide you may paint yourself into a corner through that self guidance. So I think cherry picking can be anything in the app, and you should feel comfortable doing it. But if you don't find anything there, then you have to kind of put a period at the end of the sentence with some standard formal process, whether it's that local flight, 4 things that you check, or a short cross-country briefing that you're going on, or for a longer flight, maybe some of these extra products as well. But only after all of that is done will you get that feeling Chris was talking about, where it's like, I am completely satiated here. Like I feel as confident as one can feel that I got all the information. And nobody's perfect. So like if you start this process and you have that satiated feeling and you go out there and you fly a flight and you realize, holy cow, I missed that thing, whatever it is, that's so obvious, right? Great. Like you correct the process. What in your process allowed you to miss that? How can you plug the hole in the boat, and how can you modify the procedures going forward? But you have to have some standard procedure to ever get to that completely confident, satiated feeling, or you will end up being that person, like the story I told you, like I was sitting at the end of the runway missing the Notam that the runway's closed. Someday, somehow, that'll continue to happen to you.
Yeah, I like this because it's calling out the obvious. And what I mean by that is we're all humans. Like you said, you're going to be sitting on your couch and you're gonna look at something that kind of speaks to you, and that's okay. That's the whole point. It's okay to just kind of start someplace because that's the hot topic for the day. That's totally fine. And then from there, that might lead you on to the next subject and the next, and by the end of it, when you're taking inventory of what you looked at, if you need more, or if you're actually going to go fly and you're feeling you need something a little bit more concrete or a little more, quote quote official, yeah, go ahead and run that briefing. And at the end of it, what you've done is you've gone through a series of checklist of items to make you comfortable and safe to go fly. That's the whole point. Just start somewhere natural and comfortable, and by the end of it, you're briefed, you've got everything you need to go. And after doing this several times, or just acknowledging that that's what you're doing, you're going to get into a flow, and before you go fly, you'll have that gut feeling I talked about.
Yeah.
Awesome. Moving on to the next one. What source is used for the daily forecast? So that daily forecast is a proprietary forecast model that's developed by the Weather Company, which is a company that's owned by IBM. And so if you want to learn more about it, you can look into it online. So also, I saw a lot of questions with people asking what the little WX button was, and I believe that was when we were showing the daily weather that you can find on the maps view. And so if you just tap hold anywhere on the map, you just press your finger on the map, you get the pop-up that shows all the nearby waypoints and airports and airspace and stuff. If you look in the very top right corner of that add to route pop-up, there's the little WX button. And so one of the great features of that daily weather forecast, yeah, here we go. One of the great features of it is it's not tied to any airport the way that a TAF or a MOS is. It's a forecast model that can generate a forecast for any location on Earth. So no matter where you are, you can get this forecast for that location using that WX button. A couple of other things.
Obviously, I just think that's the coolest thing ever.
Yeah.
I really, we've gotten a lot of feedback on this product, on this feature, and I personally just think it's so cool.
One other really great thing with this is, Jason, if you just actually go back to your iPad home screen and tap hold on the ForeFlight icon, you get a pop-up that says local forecast.
The ForeFlight icon. Which one's the ForeFlight icon?
Just go home.
Yeah, I mean, if you like press the home button to leave, and you can do that if you want to, but if you press hold on that ForeFlight icon, yeah, there you go. If you press hold on that, you get some options that pop up. And one of them, the second one, is local forecast. And if you tap that, that will immediately open the daily forecast to your current lat long. So no matter where you are, you can just press that to see this quick forecast. So
wow, that's
super
cool.
useful. Yeah.
See, I learned something about ForeFlight every day. That's why we're doing this webinar.
Right.
So much
to teach Jason more about ForeFlight.
Or just like who can keep up with all of it? It's amazing.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So another question here: can you get the HTML briefing for international flights? So the answer is no. Yeah, unfortunately, the HTML briefing is only available essentially for the US and maybe if you're just across the border in Canada or Mexico, but for the most part, it's a US only product. So if you're flying internationally, then you'll have to go with the PDF briefing. Next question: what weather or any other feature of ForeFlight generate an automatic record of having been briefed? Chris, do you think you could answer that one?
Yeah, I'll take that one. That's a little bit of a hot topic in aviation and instruction and whatnot. And the truth is, there's really no such thing as an official briefing. What you're doing is you're satisfying the law that you have all available information. Okay, and part of doing that is getting some kind of briefing that you can then recall later if ever questioned, right? So back in the day, you'd go see the briefer, and the briefer could vouch, yeah, I saw that pilot. Or when you called, you actually had your voice on record, and so there was a way to recall that. With DUATs, you had a username and a password, right? It's the same thing with ForeFlight. If you actually get a briefing, obviously you're using your subscription that you paid for. You have a unique username and password, and technically no one else should have that either. And so if you do a briefing and you are able to self-brief, you are able, and we could, if needed, to pull that up for you if there was ever a reason to do so.
Yeah, and one thing to remember with the briefing, it is saved on our servers. It's also saved on device, but remember that if you request a briefing for a flight, you go and fly, you come back, you open ForeFlight. If you go and make some change to that flight plan, ForeFlight will then try to generate a new briefing because you changed the flight, and so that briefing will no longer be available on your device. So if you want to make sure that a briefing stays accessible on your iPad or iPhone, once you generate it, just don't mess with the flight plan anymore. Just leave it as it is, and that briefing will always be accessible. But again, it is also stored on our servers, so even if you lose it on the iPad, you can email into us and we can find it.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that, Sam.
Yeah, no problem. Couple of other questions here because I know we're running a bit over time. You zipped past the TAFs and the passing times. Can you go over that again? So do you think one of you can pull up the briefing again to the TAFs, and Chris, maybe you can go over that once more?
Absolutely, I'm pulling that up right now. Let's see. Alrighty, let's go to forecast TAFs. All right, so here is a flight that I did from Daytona Beach to Montgomery, Alabama. And as I scroll up, you'll notice it's listing all the different TAF times for each, for different locations or different airports along my route, okay? But you're also noticing that it's got a green and a magenta that's gonna indicate kind of the general conditions, if you will, whether it be VFR, IFR, for the estimated time of my passing along that route, right? So basically what we've done is just kind of a little matrix for you, so it's really easy to follow along to cross-check the actual, text that you're reading versus the passing time, okay? That's it. That's simple.
Yeah, that and as you saw with some of the other parts of the briefing, we do similar things there to just to help you understand whether the TAF or a SIGMET or an AirMet or any of those things are going to be active during your passing time, just so you don't have to sit there and think through all the math in your head to figure out if it's going to be effective. All right, so just a couple more here. Do you have to pack to be able to retrieve the briefing in flight? So no, we do always recommend, as Jason and Chris have both been saying, we always recommend that you pack before your flight to make sure you have all the most recent information, but the briefing has nothing to do with pack. So like I said before, as long as you generate that briefing and then don't change the flight plan after generating it, it will still be available during the flight. But yeah, like they were saying, the pack is always a great step to take before going and flying. And we've already answered this question about the official briefing, so I think that's pretty much it. It's been really great seeing all of the questions coming in, and especially people seeing something that they didn't realize existed and saying, wow, that's really cool, that's awesome. We really appreciate all the great feedback and appreciate all of you for attending this webinar. Thanks again to Jason and Chris. Like I said before, this was a really fantastic presentation. And before everyone jumps off, if you want to see a recording of this, or if you want to send it to your friends so that they can benefit from it, we will be uploading this to YouTube, and you can watch the recording at foreflight.com/PIC, like you can see on the screen here. Just go there tomorrow or Friday, and you'll be able to watch the recording. So again, go to learnthefinerpoints.com or youtube.com/thefinerpoints to check out more content from Jason Miller. If you have any questions, like I said before, please email team@foreflight.com and we'll get back to you with the answers. But with that, thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks, everybody.